Welcome back to the Green Bottom Line. We are excited to kick off Season 3 with our very first episode, ESG Inside the Data Center.
It's great to be here.
So before we really get into it, I want you, the listener, to just try and imagine the entire country of France.
Okay, France.
Right, like imagine every single home, every bakery in Paris, every high-speed train cutting across the countryside, and every industrial steel factory in the north.
That's a lot of power.
It is. And in 2024, the data centers that power our digital lives, they consumed 415 terawatt-hours of electricity.
Wow.
Which is, yeah, it's actually more than that entire nation's annual grid demand. And by 2030, that number is projected to more than double.
So we're essentially adding another major European country to the global grid in just, what, 6 years?
Exactly. So whether you are an infrastructure investor who's, allocating billions of dollars, or a developer navigating local zoning laws, or honestly, just someone who uses a smartphone every day and wants to know what actually happens in the physical world when you query an AI, this deep dive is for you.
It's such a crucial topic.
It really is. We are looking squarely at the physical backbone of the digital economy today. And to pull back the curtain on this, we're drawing from a really comprehensive set of materials.
Right, we've got some heavy hitters.
Yeah. We are synthesizing an extensive 2026 collaboration between the Environmental Defense Fund and Nuveen, and we're combining that with the deep intelligence from our Season 3 research base, which is called Decoding Data Centers.
And, the central mission here, the thing we really want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this, is how we balance things.
Right, because global AI spending is crossing the $2 trillion mark in 2026.
Exactly. So how on earth do we balance this relentless, almost exponential demand for computing power with the very real, very unyielding physical constraints of our planet?
That is the defining tension of the entire global economy right now, I think.
I completely agree. And as we sort of synthesize this incredibly complex web of energy and water and community impacts today, I want to establish the analytical lens we're going to use.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Critical thinking is just absolutely paramount here because this whole sector represents a paradox.
How so?
Well, the data center boom presents these massive idiosyncratic and systemic risks. I mean, we are talking about infrastructure demands that can genuinely break regional power grids. They can deplete centuries-old aquifers. They can ignite intense local political firestorms. But, and this is the paradox at the exact same time, because the pressure is just so intense, it is forcing incredible opportunities for sustainable value creation.
Like forced innovation.
Exactly. Thermodynamic leaps in engineering. You really cannot understand the financial returns of this space without understanding the environmental physics. They are one and the same now.
Okay, let's unpack this financial gravity first, because the scale is, it's almost hard to comprehend.
The numbers are staggering.
Yeah, we're talking about global AI spending that eclipsed $1 trillion in 2025. And now it's barreling past $2 trillion in 2026.
Yeah.
And the capital that is flooding into the physical data center space is just unprecedented. The sources show $50 billion was allocated specifically to data centers in 2024.
Just to give that some historical context, that number was $11 billion back in 2020.
That is a massive jump.
It is. And we have to remember, that $50 billion, that's just the direct pure play allocation.
Wait, there's more?
Oh, yeah. If you look at the broader infrastructure funds that are, pivoting to capture this tailwind, they raised $87 billion total across the sector in 2024 alone.
Wow.
Yeah, we are seeing the definition of mega deals just completely rewritten. I mean, it used to be that $1 billion tech acquisition was front page news. Now we're looking at sovereign wealth funds teaming up with asset managers to build these unprecedented war chests.
Right, like BlackRock's Global Infrastructure Partners, GIP and Microsoft, and MGX, which is an AI investment company out of the UAE. They announced a potential $100 billion AI infrastructure fund.
$100 billion.
Yeah, $100 billion. And then you have GIP acquiring Aligned Data Centers for roughly $40 billion. These are numbers normally reserved for national defense budgets, not corporate real estate.
Well, what's fascinating here is it isn't just the sticker price of that $40 billion Aligned Data Centers deal. It's actually the mechanics of the due diligence.
Tell me more about that.
So the sources note that GIP used ERM Environmental Resources Management as their lead ESG and EHS diligence advisor.
Okay, and who are they?
is one of the largest pure-play sustainability consultancies in the world.
Ah, I see.
So when a sovereign-backed infrastructure fund deploys $40 billion and their primary gatekeeper is an environmental consultancy, that is a seismic signal to the market.
It really changes the narrative.
Right. ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, it's no longer just a marketing exercise or a nice-to-have addendum. It is a hard binary investment filter.
It's the gatekeeper to the capital.
Exactly.
But walk me through how that actually works in practice.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm throwing down $40 billion,
Hmm.
what is an ESG consultant actually looking for that could, kill the deal?
They are looking for execution risk. Period.
Okay.
The sources cite a GRESB survey showing that 97% of investors plan to increase their data center allocations, but 93% make sustainability data a strict condition of that investment.
Because it's about risk-adjusted returns now, not just morals.
Precisely. They are looking at the local power grid queue. Like, if this facility needs 300 megawatts, is the utility actually capable of delivering it by 2028? Or will the developer just be stuck with an empty concrete shell?
That would be a very expensive show.
Right. They're also looking at water rights. Does the facility rely on a river basin that's currently under drought restrictions? They're looking at soil contamination. And increasingly, they are looking at community
The
relations.
social aspect.
Yeah, because if a facility loses its social license and gets shut down by local zoning boards, your $40 billion asset is stranded. So ESG diligence is really just risk management with a longer time horizon.
It's like looking at a sleek new smartphone and completely ignoring the massive global mining and refining and manufacturing operation that actually built it.
That's a great analogy.
Right? Like, we see the big logos, the Microsofts, the Googles, Metas, Amazons, the hyperscalers,
Yep, the household names.
but we're completely blind to the utilities, the concrete makers, the chip fabs, the cooling tower manufacturers. The sources use this concept called the iceberg, which I think is a perfect framing.
It illustrates the fragmentation of the industry perfectly. The hyperscalers are really just the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah.
the 10% that's visible above the waterline.
Because they're the ones we interact with.
Exactly. They drive the software demand, they train the large language models, and they are the consumer-facing brands that make all these grand net zero pledges. But the massive underwater base, the bulk of the actual physical and environmental reality, consists of a vast, highly complex supply chain that the hyperscaler doesn't actually own.
Because hyperscalers don't always build their own buildings.
Usually they don't.
Right. A lot of times they lease the space. You have colocation developers, basically real estate companies, who actually go out, buy the farmland, pour the hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, and build the physical shell.
Right.
And then you have the electric utilities that have to somehow generate and transmit gigawatts of power to that specific plot of land.
And don't forget the semiconductor giants building the incredibly energy-intensive GPUs.
Oh, and the natural gas companies feeding the backup generator.
Which creates a profound accountability vacuum.
How so?
Well, when you have a triple net lease structure where a tech giant is leasing the building and paying for the power, but a real estate developer actually owns the physical asset who claims the carbon emissions.
Oh, that's messy.
Very. Who is actually on the hook when the local community protests the noise? Is it the developer who poured the concrete? Is it the utility that burned the coal to provide the power?
Or the hyperscaler whose AI workload is spinning the servers.
Exactly. Who holds the bag?
And investors are getting nervous about that exact vacuum. They're demanding auditable transparency. You mentioned GRESB earlier, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark.
Yes.
The sources show that participation by data centers in this benchmark rose 28% in 2024. They're tracking over 840 locations globally now.
And here's the why behind that sudden rush for data. A single 50-megawatt hyperscale data center carries the annual carbon footprint of roughly 100 energy-efficient office buildings.
Wait, really? One data center equals 100 office buildings.
One single 50-megawatt facility, yes. So if you are a traditional real estate portfolio manager, that ratio is terrifying.
I can imagine.
Because you might have spent the last decade painstakingly retrofitting your downtown office high-rises, putting in smart thermostats and LED lighting to hit your portfolio's carbon reduction targets.
Doing everything right.
Right. And then your fund acquires one single medium-sized data center, and it completely obliterates your carbon baseline. You have effectively bought an industrial-scale manufacturing plant's footprint, but it's classified on your books as commercial real estate.
Wow. Okay, so if one single data center equals 100 office buildings, we need to look exactly at where that massive footprint comes from. Let's start with the most obvious culprit: energy.
Let's do it.
Because we know the drill on the standard greenhouse gas accounting scopes, right? Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. But data centers completely warp the traditional ratios of those scopes.
They really do. Let's dig into the physics of this footprint, starting with Scope 1.
Okay.
So Scope 1 covers the direct emissions generated right on site. For a normal office building, this might be, say, the natural gas burned in the basement boiler.
Right.
But for a data center, Scope 1 is actually a relatively small piece of the pie during normal operations. It primarily consists of the massive diesel backup generators.
Right, and they don't run those constantly. They're just for emergencies.
Correct. But they have to be tested regularly, usually once a month. And that burns diesel and emits localized particulate matter into the neighborhood.
So it's small, but it's not zero.
Right. And Scope 1 also includes fugitive emissions. That's the slow, inevitable leakage of the chemical refrigerants used in the massive air conditioning units.
Oh, like the Freon in your car, but on an industrial scale.
Exactly. And these refrigerants, like HFCs, often have a global warming potential thousands of times greater than carbon dioxide.
But the real behemoth is Scope 2, right? The emissions from the electricity,
Yeah.
the facility purchases from the grid.
Yes, and this is entirely dictated by geography. It's completely location dependent.
Makes sense.
If you physically locate your data center in a region powered predominantly by hydroelectric dams or offshore wind, your Scope 2 footprint is practically negligible. But if you build that exact same facility in a region reliant on a legacy coal fleet, your Scope 2 emissions are astronomical.
And the sources provide a staggering example of how this localized grid strain plays out on a macro-national level. Let's look at Ireland.
Ireland is the perfect extreme example.
Right. So in 2024, data centers consumed 22% of Ireland's entire national electricity production.
Which is up from just 5% back in 2015.
But if you zoom in on Dublin specifically, data centers account for a staggering 79% of the city's total electricity demand.
Okay, let's unpack the grid mechanics of that Dublin statistic, because it is crucial for understanding the systemic risk here.
Please do.
A power grid operates on real-time balance, right? Supply must exactly match demand at every single second. Now, human electricity demand fluctuates. We wake up, we turn on the lights, run the kettle, go to work, come home, cook dinner.
Right, it has peaks and valleys.
Exactly. A data center, however, is a baseload consumer. It draws massive, unrelenting power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It never sleeps.
Never. So when one single industry takes up nearly 80% of a capital city's power, it eats up all the cheap, efficient baseload generation.
Leaving what for everyone else?
Well, it forces the local grid operator to fire up older, highly inefficient, carbon-intensive peaking plants, usually older gas or oil plants, just to handle the normal daily fluctuations of the human residents.
So the human residents of Dublin aren't just competing with the data centers for the actual electricity. They're actively having their local grid dirtied by the sheer lack of capacity.
Exactly.
But as wild as that Scope 2 number is, it's Scope 3 that I really want to drill into. Because we generally assume that a data center's biggest impact is the electricity it plugs into.
That's the common misconception, yeah.
But the research points out that Scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions up and down the value chain, represent between 38% and 69% of a facility's total carbon footprint. Why is that ratio so incredibly high compared to regular real estate?
It all comes down to the refresh cycle. Scope 3 is your embodied carbon. It's the massive amount of greenhouse gases released to manufacture the thousands of tons of steel and to calcine the cement required to build the warehouse structure itself.
Yeah, the building materials.
Right. But the real culprit is the IT hardware. Fabricating silicon microchips, servers, and network switches is one of the most energy-intensive manufacturing processes on Earth.
Right, and assume a commercial HVAC system in an office building lasts for, 25 to 30 years? You pay the embodied carbon penalty once and you spread it out over 3 decades.
Exactly. But in the AI sector, technology advances so violently fast that a multi-million-dollar rack of specialized GPUs might be completely technologically obsolete in 36 months.
Just 3 years.
Yeah. So every 3 to 5 years, you are ripping out thousands of servers and replacing them with newly manufactured ones. That embodied carbon penalty isn't a one-time construction cost. It is a recurring triennial tax on the planet.
So to combat this overwhelming energy and carbon arithmetic, the tech industry is pulling a lever that I find genuinely shocking.
The nuclear pivot.
Yes, the nuclear pivot. In 2025 alone, tech companies committed over $10 billion to nuclear energy partnerships.
It really represents a total philosophical inversion for the tech sector. I mean, for the last decade, they have positioned themselves as the champions of wind and solar.
Right. Very green, very renewable.
But now we are seeing Amazon commit $500 million to X Energy for small modular reactors. Google signed a 1.8 gigawatt agreement with Elemental Power to deploy novel reactor designs.
And then there's the big one.
Right. Most notably, Microsoft signed a 20-year power purchase agreement to fund the restart of an intact reactor at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. You were telling me that Microsoft is actively funding the restart of 3 Mile Island, the site of the worst commercial nuclear accident in U.S. history.
Yes.
From a purely ESG perspective, how is introducing radioactive waste risk and the incredibly complex tail risk of a localized nuclear incident better than just waiting for solar and wind arrays to catch up? I mean, that feels like we are trading a global carbon crisis for a highly concentrated radioactive risk. I'm missing something in the logic here?
No, it is a totally valid critique, and honestly, it is a debate currently tearing the ESG community apart. But the logic from the hyperscalers is purely mathematical. It's based on that grid physics we just discussed.
The baseload issue.
Right. Solar and wind are intermittent. The wind stops blowing, the sun goes down. But AI training models cannot pause. If a training run for a trillion parameter model is interrupted by a power dip, it can ruin months of work and millions of dollars of compute time.
They need it to be perfect.
The industry demands 5 nines of reliability. That's 99.999% uptime. That means a facility can only tolerate about 5 minutes of downtime per year.
5 minutes a year, that's insane. So they need clean baseload power. Power that runs 24/7, doesn't emit carbon, and frankly, doesn't care if it's cloudy out.
Exactly. And right now, the only technology on Earth that does that at a gigawatt scale is nuclear fission. They view the statistical tail risk of a nuclear incident as a highly managed, localized engineering problem.
Whereas carbon is guaranteed destruction.
Exactly. They view the guaranteed failure of the climate due to carbon emissions as an existential certainty. Furthermore, by signing these 20-year power purchase agreements, or PPAs, companies like Microsoft are providing the bankable collateral that utilities need to actually secure the billions in financing required to restart or build these reactors.
So they're funding the renaissance.
The tech companies are essentially acting as the anchor tenants for the entire nuclear renaissance, yes.
Which leads us directly into what the sources call the additionality debate. Because before this nuclear pivot, tech companies were claiming they were already powered by 100% renewable energy. And they were doing that by relying on REC's renewable energy certificates.
RECs. The REC market is arguably one of the most misunderstood mechanisms in corporate sustainability.
So let's break down exactly how it works. When a company claims they are 100% renewable using RECs, they aren't actually running a dedicated copper wire from a wind farm directly to their servers, right?
Definitely not.
They're essentially just buying an accounting mechanism. I was thinking about this. It's like eating a giant bacon double cheeseburger for lunch, but paying someone else across the country to eat a kale salad and then legally claiming you're on a diet.
That is a brutally accurate analogy. I love that. REC is a tradable market instrument. When a wind farm in Texas generates 1 megawatt hour of electricity and puts it onto the grid, it also generates 1 REC. So a tech company operating a data center in Ohio, which is largely powered by coal and natural gas, can buy that Texas REC. At the end of the year, they tally up the megawatt hours they pulled from the dirty Ohio grid, match it against the RECs they bought from Texas, and claim they are 100% renewable on an annual volumetric basis.
Even though the physical electrons powering their servers in Ohio were generated by burning coal.
Exactly. This is known as match-based accounting. And the core critique from environmentalists is that it completely lacks additionality.
What does additionality mean in this context?
Additionality means your capital investment actually caused new clean energy capacity to be built that would not have existed otherwise. Buying cheap existing RECs from a wind farm that was built 10 years ago does absolutely nothing to decarbonize the local grid you are actually drawing power from.
It's literally just shifting numbers on a spreadsheet.
Which is why the gold standard is shifting now. The sources point out that Google, and increasingly others, are pushing for a much more rigorous standard called 24/7 carbon-free energy, or CFE.
And how is that different?
This abandons the annual REC shell game completely. Under 247 CFE, if a data center consumes 1 megawatt of power in Ohio at 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, the company must prove that 1 megawatt of clean energy was generated in Ohio at 2:00 a.m. on that exact Tuesday to cover it.
Oh, wow.
It demands temporal and locational matching.
And that is incredibly difficult, which circles us right back to why they are so desperate for nuclear power.
Yeah.
Because getting solar power in Ohio at 2:00 a.m. is physically impossible.
Right.
But what happens when they can't get nuclear approvals fast enough and the renewables aren't there? The research points to a very dark interim reality. Fossil fuel lock-in.
This is perhaps the most acute short-term climate risk in the entire sector right now.
Because the demand is right now.
Exactly. The hyperscalers are demanding gigawatts of power today, not in 2035 when the new nuclear plants might finally be ready. Utility executives are facing a real crisis. To guarantee that 99.999% uptime, utilities are actively delaying the scheduled retirements of legacy coal plants.
They're keeping them on life support.
Yes. And worse, they are building massive new natural gas peaker plants to handle the surge.
And if we're talking about a massive expansion of natural gas infrastructure just to feed data centers, we have to talk about the silent killer in that supply chain, methane.
Methane is the critical, severely underreported blind spot in natural gas expansion. When a utility burns natural gas to generate electricity, it emits roughly half the carbon dioxide of coal.
So it sounds good.
Right. On paper, it looks like a great transition fuel. But natural gas is primarily composed of methane. And methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. It's over 80 times more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2 over a 20-year period.
So if it leaks before it gets to the power plant, it defeats the entire purpose of switching from coal.
Exactly. If the upstream supply chain, the drilling at the wellhead, the compressor stations, the thousands of miles of pipelines, if that has significant fugitive leaks, the climate impact of that supposedly cleaner natural gas plant skyrockets. It often becomes worse than coal.
That's terrifying.
And here is where the technology bites back. We now have advanced satellites constantly orbiting the Earth, measuring methane plumes in real time.
Oh, because they can't hide it anymore.
Nope. The era of utilities self-reporting their leakage rates with, favorable math is over. If an investor backs a data center that relies on a utility with a leaky gas supply chain, those satellite measurements could trigger massive regulatory fines and completely invalidate the fund's net zero pledges.
That puts an immense burden on the investor. I mean, we used to just assume the power grid would be there and it would be clean enough. Now, if you were underwriting a 10-year hold on a $2 billion facility, you have to stress test the local utility's long-term generation forecasts.
Yes, you do.
You have to audit the methane leakage of their upstream pipeline suppliers. If the local utility is relying on ancient coal plants and facing furious public backlash for raising residential rates to pay for the transmission lines your data center needs, that feels like a house of cards.
It is incredibly precarious. The sources highlight data from PJM, which is the largest grid operator in the U.S. They cover 13 states.
Okay, what do their numbers look like?
PJM projects 32 gigawatts of peak load growth between 2024 and 2030, driven overwhelmingly by data centers. To put that in perspective, that is equivalent to adding the entire generation capacity that the region built over the last 20 years, but compressing it into just 6 years.
That's impossible.
Investors are waking up to the reality that if the regional grid physically cannot handle the interconnection, the project simply does not happen. Power is the ultimate bottleneck.
So energy generates the headlines, and it generates the carbon emissions. But our research base highlights a second, deeply interconnected resource being devoured behind the scenes, one that might actually be the harder, more immediate physical boundary for the industry to overcome. Let's pivot to water.
Yes, water. It's frequently called the overlooked crisis of the digital economy. We conceptually think of advanced electronics and water as natural enemies, Keep your laptop away from your coffee. But massive hyperscale data centers are profoundly thirsty.
Let's put some hard numbers to that thirst. The traditional cooling method for these facilities relies on massive evaporative cooling towers. You drive past these buildings and you see these huge industrial units just venting water vapor into the sky.
Right.
The sources note that a single 1 megawatt data center utilizing evaporative cooling can consume 25.5 million liters of water annually.
Which is just a massive volume.
It's the equivalent of the daily water needs of 300,000 human beings. And remember, we aren't building 1 megawatt facilities anymore. We are moving toward campuses that are hundreds of megawatts, even approaching a gigawatt in scale.
And we must emphasize, this is not a theoretical, abstract environmental projection for the year 2050. Hydrological stress is translating into hard operational and legal reality right now.
Give an example.
The sources highlight a highly illustrative case from 2024, where Google had its planning permissions partially revoked for a massive facility in Cerrillos, Chile.
Revoked specifically over water rights, right? The
Yeah.
local community fought back.
Yes. The region was suffering from a multi-year megadrought. The original design for the data center relied on pulling millions of liters from the local aquifer for cooling.
Gain a draft.
Right. So when a local municipality looks at a dropping water table and the political leaders have to choose between providing drinking water for their citizens, allowing agricultural irrigation for local farmers, or cooling the servers for a foreign tech company's AI model, the data center is going to lose that political battle every single time.
As it should.
So Google was forced to completely redesign the facility to use air-cooled systems instead, which cost massive amounts of time and capital. If a developer hasn't priced in granular basin-level hydrological stress during their initial site selection, they're facing a severe risk of operational curtailment or completely stranded assets.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because the industry knows this water crisis is an existential threat, and they are radically pivoting the technology. We are seeing a massive shift away from just blasting cold air across a room of servers and moving toward liquid cooling.
It's a forced thermodynamic evolution. The power density of the new AI chips, like NVIDIA's Blackwell architecture, is so intensely high that traditional air-based HVAC systems physically cannot dissipate the heat fast enough. Air is simply a terrible conductor of heat compared to liquid.
So they are bringing the liquid directly to the silicon. The sources outline a couple of distinct methodologies here. There's direct-to-chip, or D2C, where they mount tiny, highly engineered cold plates carrying liquid coolant directly onto the CPUs and GPUs inside the server rack.
Right.
The one that really sounds like pure science fiction is immersion cooling.
Immersion cooling is exactly what it sounds like. It involves taking the entire server, chassis, motherboards, memory processors, and all, and literally submerging them into large vats of engineered fluid.
So the pinnacle of human engineering, our multi-trillion-dollar AI revolution, ultimately comes down to deep frying our computers so they don't catch fire.
It is a hilarious visual, I admit.
Right.
But the physics are extraordinary. The fluid they use is dielectric, meaning it does not conduct electrical current. You can drop a live powered-on circuit board into a bath of fluorochemicals or synthetic oils, and it won't short out. But because the fluid makes direct, intimate contact with every single heat-generating component on the board, it transfers the thermal energy away incredibly fast.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. Like, if a server is submerged in a vat of oil, how does it actually shed the heat? And how on earth does a technician perform maintenance? Do they just pull a dripping server out of a deep fryer?
So in a two-phase immersion system, the dielectric fluid actually has a very low boiling point, often around 50 degrees Celsius. When the GPU gets hot, it literally boils the fluid touching it.
It boils it.
Yes, the fluid turns into a vapor, rises to the top of the sealed tank, hits a water-cooled condenser coil, turns back into a liquid, and then rains back down onto the servers. It is a completely passive, continuous cycle of phase change cooling.
That is wild.
And to answer your second question, yes, maintenance is a mess. It requires specialized cranes to lift the heavy racks out of the fluid. They have to drip dry, and technicians require completely different training. It increases operational complexity massively.
But the efficiency gains are worth the headache. The sources note that immersion cooling can achieve a power usage effectiveness, a PUE of 1.05. And it can reduce the overall energy consumed by cooling infrastructure by up to 50% compared to traditional air conditioning.
Because you are eliminating the need for hundreds of massive energy-devouring fans spinning constantly to push air through the facility.
Okay, but this raises a very obvious geographical question for me. If water scarcity is becoming such a hard boundary, and these facilities generate so much immense heat, why aren't all data centers just built in freezing climates?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Why are we building data centers in the Arizona desert or the water-stressed plains of Spain? Why not put them all in Iceland or northern Canada or the Arctic Circle, where you can essentially just open a warehouse window to cool the servers?
It is the most logical question, and the answer comes down to two unyielding forces: physics and politics.
Let's start with physics.
The physics aspect is latency. Data traveling over fiber optic cables is constrained by the speed of light. It takes time. If you are a financial firm doing high-frequency algorithmic trading in New York, or an autonomous vehicle needing split-second navigation processing in London, you cannot afford the millisecond delay of routing your data to a server farm in the Arctic and waiting for the response.
Ah, so you need the compute power physically close to the end user
Exactly. You can't change the speed of light.
and the political aspect.
Data sovereignty. In the wake of massive privacy scandals and geopolitical fracturing, nations are passing strict laws requiring that their citizens' data physically reside within their national borders.
Like GDPR.
Exactly. The European Union's GDPR is a prime example, but it's happening globally. A bank in Germany cannot legally store its customers' financial data in a server in a cold, unregulated jurisdiction. So you end up being legally forced to build these massive heat-generating data centers near major population hubs and financial centers, regardless of whether the local climate is hot or the local water basin is severely stressed.
Which creates a vicious cycle that the sources define as the sustainability triangle.
Exactly. The 3 points of the triangle are energy, carbon, and water. The inherent tension is that optimizing for one point almost always degrades another.
Explain how that trade-off works in real life.
So if a developer faces strict water regulations and wants to design a zero-water cooling system, they have to rely on massive, closed-loop mechanical chillers, essentially giant air conditioners.
Okay.
These use zero local water, but they require huge amounts of electricity to run the compressors. That electricity spike increases the facility's overall energy demand, which in turn increases its Scope 2 carbon footprint.
Then the other way around.
Conversely, if you want to use very little electricity to keep your PU low and save on power costs, you use evaporative water towers. Those use less power, but they drain millions of liters from the local aquifer. You are constantly trapped, trading one critical resource constraint for another based on whatever the local regulator's most angry about that week.
And just to add another layer of absolute madness to this accounting, the sources mention a concept called Scope 2 water. I had never even heard of this before. Walk me through the physics of Scope 2 water, because this feels like the ultimate hidden cost.
It is a brilliant, entirely obscured metric that is just starting to terrify ESG analysts. We discussed Scope 2 emissions, the carbon emitted by the distant power plant that generates your electricity. Scope 2 water is the massive amount of water consumed by that exact same power plant to generate your electricity.
Because almost all non-renewable power plants are essentially just giant steam engines.
Right. Exactly. Whether it is a coal plant, a nuclear reactor, or a natural gas combined cycle plant, the fundamental physics of power generation rely on the Rankine cycle. They burn fuel or split atoms to boil water into high-pressure steam.
Right.
That steam spins a massive turbine, which spins a magnet inside a coil of wire to create electricity. But to complete the cycle, you have to cool that steam back down into water.
Oh.
Power plants use colossal cooling towers to do this, evaporating millions of gallons of river or lake water in the process.
So the implication is, even if a data center developer spends millions of dollars to install a state-of-the-art zero-water liquid cooling system on site, if they plug that data center into a grid powered by a thirsty coal plant 50 miles away, their indirect water footprint is still draining the regional basin.
Precisely. They have just offshored their water consumption to the utility. And advanced ESG frameworks are beginning to demand that investors account for the hydrological stress of the entire supply chain, not just the water pipe going into their specific building.
Wow. You really cannot escape the physical reality of these systems. The impacts just get shuffled around. But before we leave the physical hardware and talk about the communities, we have to talk about what happens when these machines inevitably die. We touched on the 3-year hardware refresh cycle earlier, but let's dive into the end-of-life process. E-waste.
It is a massive, heavily underreported shadow over the industry. Because we are turning over thousands of racks of servers every 36 months, the volume of discarded electronics is staggering.
And these aren't just empty metal boxes. As we discussed with the Scope 3 emissions, these servers are incredibly complex chemical and mineral cocktails. They are packed with heavy metals, highly toxic lead and mercury, flame retardants in the plastics,
Right.
and an immense amount of rare earth elements like neodymium and tantalum that were strip mined halfway across the world.
Which brings us to the crucial practice of IT asset disposition, or ITAD. Historically, a lot of this hardware was simply shredded, smelted down for base metals, or worse, shipped to unregulated e-waste dumps in developing nations where it leached toxic chemicals into the groundwater.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. But today, proper ITAD management is becoming a strict legal and compliance issue. The goal is to securely wipe the data, test the components and either refurbish the chips for secondary markets or carefully extract the rare earth minerals for recycling.
The sources provide a really solid metric for why this matters. They note that utilizing certified ITAD protocols can reduce 1.2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent for every 100 devices diverted from a landfill. It recovers the embodied carbon.
That's a huge carbon saving.
Yeah, ESG frameworks and government regulators are increasingly demanding an unbroken, auditable chain of custody. They want to know exactly which recycling facility that obsolete NVIDIA GPU ended up in.
But, it isn't all waste and pollution. There is one genuinely positive, highly innovative thermodynamic loop emerging in the industry, specifically regarding all that heat the servers generate. The sources highlight the rapid growth of the heat reuse trend, particularly taking hold in Europe.
I love this concept. Instead of just treating the heat as a waste product and venting it out of a cooling tower into the atmosphere, operators are capturing the hot water from their cooling systems and feeding it directly into municipal district heating networks.
It is a beautiful piece of civic engineering. District heating systems pipe hot water underneath cities to warm local homes, schools, and public swimming pools.
But wait, how hot is the water coming off a server rack? Like, is it actually hot enough to heat an apartment block in the dead of winter?
Generally, the water exiting a traditional air-cooled data center is around 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. That is warm, but it's not hot enough for municipal heating, which usually requires water closer to 70 or 80 degrees.
Right, 30 degrees is like a lukewarm bath.
Exactly. So the data center or the municipality has to install massive industrial heat pumps to compress and boost the temperature of the water before it enters the city grid. But with the advent of the liquid immersion cooling we discussed earlier, the fluid is boiling directly off the chips, so the water leaving the facility is significantly hotter.
Making it much more efficient to integrate.
Yes, exactly, making it much more efficient to integrate into city heating.
Which is incredible to think about.
Yeah.
We are literally using the waste heat generated by someone typing a query into ChatGPT to heat a family's apartment during a European winter. And the sources note this is rapidly transitioning from being just a cool, voluntary innovation into a strict regulatory mandate.
It really is.
In markets like Germany and Denmark, you simply will not get your initial planning permissions approved unless your architectural blueprints include a physical connection to the local district heating network. You have to prove you are a thermal asset to the city.
And that transition from being a silent warehouse to being deeply integrated into a city's infrastructure perfectly sets up our next major topic. Because when a single facility consumes a city's worth of power, drains a city's worth of water, and pumps out a city's worth of heat, the human beings actually living in that city are going to look up and start asking questions.
Exactly. Which brings us to the S in ESG, social. But we aren't talking about abstract labor policies here. We are talking about community, land use, and localized physical impacts. Because as we just established, hyperscale data centers require massive, sprawling land footprints.
Huge amounts of land.
Right. You need space for the warehouse structures themselves, the massive electrical substations, the cooling towers, the security perimeters, and the diesel storage tanks.
And finding 100 acres of contiguous land that also happens to sit precisely at the intersection of high-capacity fiber optic backbone cables and massive high-voltage power transmission lines is incredibly difficult.
A very specific Venn diagram.
It is. It almost inevitably puts developers in direct conflict with local municipal planning priorities. We are seeing intense litigious conflicts over developers trying to rezone protected greenbelt designations, paving over highly productive agricultural land, and threatening local biodiversity habitats.
And the impacts experienced by the local residents aren't just invisible things like carbon emissions. They are highly visceral, daily disruptions. A data center takes years to build, which means the local residents experience endless convoys of heavy construction trucks tearing up their quiet local roads.
That's just the construction phase.
Exactly. Once operational, they experience the noise, the persistent, inescapable, low-frequency hum of hundreds of industrial cooling fans running 24/7.
That low-frequency noise issue is becoming a major vector for litigation. Unlike the high-pitched whine of a jet engine, low-frequency acoustic waves penetrate through the walls and windows of residential homes, causing sleep deprivation and severe psychological stress for the neighbors.
That sounds miserable.
It is. Furthermore, during times of grid strain, when the utility asks the data center to drop off the grid, those massive diesel backup generators kick on, blanketing the immediate neighborhood in localized air pollution and particulate matter.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, We're looking at a profound structural tension between global capital and local impact.
Yes. The underlying economic model is deeply asymmetrical. The profits of the AI revolution, the skyrocketing stock valuations of the hyperscalers, the incredible leaps in medical research and software efficiency, those benefits accrue globally.
Right.
They go to shareholders in New York, users in Tokyo, researchers in London. But the physical burden, the grid strain causing local residential utility bills to spike, the sleep-destroying hum of the chillers, the depletion of the local farming aquifer, that immense burden is felt hyper-locally by a few thousand people in a very specific suburban or rural neighborhood.
And those neighborhoods are pushing back with extraordinary ferocity. The sources highlight a pivotal moment. In December 2025, a coalition of over 230 environmental and local community groups across the United States formally called for a nationwide moratorium on new data center development.
It's a massive coalition.
It is. They demanded the government halt the build-out until the grid and water impacts could be fully audited. And this isn't just an isolated American phenomenon. Amsterdam, which is one of the premier tech hubs in Europe, implemented a hard moratorium on new data center development as early as 2019 because the facilities were cannibalizing the city's green energy supply and eating up valuable land.
This phenomenon is what ESG professionals call the loss of social license to operate, and I cannot stress this enough. For a long time, the traditional financial sector viewed community relations as a soft metric, a PR issue to be handled with a few sponsored Little League teams and a press release.
Right, a box to check.
Exactly. But the reality today is that social license is a hard, fiercely material execution risk. If a local community organizes against you, they can pack the town hall meetings, tie your developers up in zoning board appeals, block your environmental water permits, and trap your capital in years of paralyzing litigation.
Which turns a highly modeled, highly profitable development pipeline into a bloated portfolio of stranded assets. But let me play this skeptical investor here for a moment. If I'm a portfolio manager sitting in a glass tower in London, allocating $1 billion to a real estate fund that is building a campus in rural Virginia or a small town in Sweden, how do I actually measure whether that local community is going to revolt? How do you do due diligence on human anger?
You can't measure the anger directly, but you can aggressively audit the developer's governance frameworks and proactive engagement strategies. Smart investors are now demanding to see cumulative impact assessments.
What does that mean in practice?
It means the developer doesn't just look at their single building. They look at how their 100-megawatt facility adds to the stress already being caused by the 3 other data centers built down the road last year. Are they modeling the total strain on the regional substation? Are they negotiating legally binding, tangible community benefit agreements, like paying to upgrade the town's municipal water treatment plant or funding local workforce training programs?
Conversely, what is the red flag? What tells an investor a project is doomed?
Secrecy. If a developer operates under intense NDAs, utilizing shell companies to hide their massive power and water requirements from the local planning board until the very last minute, that is a massive red flag. That strategy of deception breeds profound civic distrust, and that distrust almost always metastasizes into litigation.
And governments and politicians are getting caught squarely in the crossfire of this asymmetry. They are trapped in a vicious political vice. On one hand, mayors and prime ministers are desperate to attract the billions of dollars of foreign direct investment, the tech prestige, and the tax revenue that come with hosting the AI boom.
Of course.
On the other hand, they have to answer to constituents who are furious that their residential electricity bills are spiking to cross-subsidize the multi-billion-dollar transmission grid upgrades required solely for a tech giant's warehouse.
It is creating incredibly volatile, reactionary policy environments. Look at the case study of the United Kingdom detailed in the sources. In September 2024, the UK government officially designated data centers as critical national infrastructure.
On paper, putting data centers in the same protected category as nuclear power plants and emergency water supplies sounds like a massive victory for the industry, right? It shows the government takes them seriously.
It is a profoundly double-edged sword. By designating them as critical national infrastructure, it placed them under the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects regime, or the NSIP.
Okay, what does that do?
The mechanical effect of this is that it allows massive data center developments to completely bypass local town councils and zoning boards and receive direct, fast-tracked ministerial consent from the central government in London.
So it solves the exact local zoning problem we were just talking about. It clears the legal hurdle.
It clears the legal hurdle, but it pours gasoline on the social friction. By utilizing central power to override local democratic control, especially when developers are trying to build on legally protected greenbelt land around London, it deeply inflames community opposition.
I can see why.
The government essentially decreed that the national economic need for AI compute overrides the local citizens' right to determine what is built in their backyard. That kind of top-down mandate forces environmental groups into much more aggressive, disruptive forms of protest because they have been locked out of the legal zoning process.
But all of this localized anger over water depletion and noise pollution isn't just existing in a vacuum of town halls and protests anymore. The financial regulators have been watching this friction, and they are finally stepping onto the battlefield. The days of putting a stock photo of a wind turbine on page 40 of your annual report, writing a vague paragraph about your commitment to the earth, and calling it green investing are legally, violently over. We are entering the era of hard, auditable metrics.
For the last decade, ESG reporting in the tech and real estate sectors was largely voluntary, unstandardized, and heavily narrative-driven. A company could selectively highlight its one solar-powered facility while quietly ignoring the 10 facilities running on coal.
Right.
That era allowed for rampant greenwashing, making a product or investment appear more environmentally sustainable than it actually is to attract the massive pools of ESG-focused capital. But that window of impunity is rapidly closing.
And we are seeing enforcement with actual teeth, backed by state prosecutors. The sources highlight a chilling precedent for the finance industry. DWS, a major asset management firm, was fined 25 million euros by German prosecutors specifically for misleading investors about the ESG credentials of their funds. And across the channel, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, is actively enforcing its Green Claims Code, with heavy scrutiny kicking off in autumn 2025.
The regulatory baseline has shifted fundamentally. If an asset manager or a tech company makes a sustainability claim today, if they use words like net zero, carbon neutral, or sustainable, that claim must be explicitly grounded in auditable, scientifically verified data. And the European Union is entirely leading the global pack on dictating exactly what that data must look like.
Let's run through the mechanics of some of this EU legislation, because whether you are a developer in Texas or a fund manager in Singapore, if you want European capital or if you operate globally, the EU is setting the de facto standard. First, you have the Energy Efficiency Directive, or ED. Specifically, Article 12 of the ED mandates incredibly strict, granular reporting for any data center with an installed power demand over 500 kilowatts.
And we should note, 500 kilowatts is a relatively small facility. It captures almost the entire commercial market. The ED demands that operators report operational data that was previously treated as highly guarded corporate secrets. They must publicly report their temperature set points, their exact water usage efficiency, and precisely how much waste heat they are capturing and utilizing. But the truly revolutionary piece of legislation is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD.
The CSRD introduces a concept that completely rewrites how companies assess risk: double materiality. Let's dive deep into this because it is the cornerstone of modern ESG regulation.
Historically, financial disclosures only cared about single materiality, which is an outside-in perspective. How does climate change pose a financial risk to the company's bottom line? For example, if a company owns a data center on the coast, how does the risk of a hurricane and sea level rise threaten the physical asset and the quarterly earnings? That is financial materiality.
The climate impacting the business.
Exactly. Double materiality adds the inside-out perspective, known as impact materiality. A company must now legally audit and publicly report how their business operations materially impact the climate and local society, regardless of whether it immediately affects their short-term profits.
So using our water example from earlier, single materiality asks, if the local river dries up due to drought, will our data center have to shut down and lose revenue? Double materiality forces them to also ask, is our data center pumping so much water out of the local aquifer that we are actively causing the local farmers to go bankrupt and destroying the regional ecosystem?
Precisely. You have to report the damage you are inflicting on the world, and you have to have a third-party auditor verify those metrics. And at the national level within Europe, governments are pushing even harder. Germany's Energy Efficiency Act, the NEPG, is setting incredibly demanding operational standards, specifically legally enforcing that waste heat reuse integration we discussed, effectively outlawing the construction of data centers that merely vent heat into the sky.
But to comply with all of these overlapping, highly technical regulations, the industry is drowning in an absolute alphabet soup of metrics. For years, the gold standard metric that every developer touted was PUE, power usage effectiveness. It's the ratio of the total amount of energy used by the entire facility divided by the energy delivered to the actual computing equipment. But the sources note that PUE on its own is deeply, dangerously flawed.
What is fascinating about PUE is how a metric can look mathematically perfect while the environmental reality is catastrophic. PUE only measures overhead efficiency.
So it's just a ratio.
Right. If a data center has a PUE of 1.1, that is considered world-class, it means that for every 1 watt of power the actual servers use to run their calculations, only zero point 0.1 watts are being wasted on overhead, like cooling fans and lighting. It means the building operates very efficiently.
And what is it hiding?
It hides the fuel source and it hides the scale. PUE tells you absolutely nothing about the carbon intensity of the electrons. You could have an industry-leading PUE of 1.1, but if your facility is plugged directly into an unabated coal power plant, your absolute carbon emissions are horrendous.
And scale.
Furthermore, PUE ignores scale. A highly efficient 1 gigawatt data center with a great PUE is still drawing more absolute power from the grid than a medium-sized country. It is efficiently doing massive environmental damage.
It completely ignores water.
Exactly. This is the deadliest flaw. A facility manager might achieve that beautiful 1.1 PUE by turning off their energy-intensive electrical chillers and switching entirely to massive evaporative water cooling towers. They essentially lower their electricity bill and improve their PUE by draining millions of gallons from the local water table. They optimize the metric at the expense of the environment.
So what does this all mean? The regulators and investors are recognizing that PUE is insufficient. The industry is moving to a holistic suite of metrics. You now have to report WUE, water usage effectiveness, which measures liters of water consumed per kilowatt hour of IT energy. You have CUE, carbon usage effectiveness, which factors in the grid's fuel mix. ERF, energy reuse factor, measuring how much of your heat goes to the district heating grid, and renewable energy factor, measuring actual additionality, not just REC accounting.
And the challenge for the capital markets is that synthesizing this alphabet soup across global portfolios is currently a nightmare. We have multiple frameworks, the ISSB, the GRI, SASB, the CDP, all trying to standardize this reporting. But there is a very promising sector-specific development. The sources note that in late 2025, GRESB partnered with an organization called iMasons to launch a dedicated global data center sustainability benchmark.
Why does a bespoke benchmark matter so much? Why couldn't they just use the standard real estate forms?
Because historically, massive real estate funds evaluated their data center holdings using the exact same ESG criteria they used for office buildings or logistics warehouses, it completely distorted the reality of the asset class. Assessing a 100-megawatt AI training facility with a questionnaire designed for a shopping mall leads to terrible data. A bespoke data center-specific benchmark allows investors to make true, apples-to-apples comparisons on grid interaction, localized water stress, and the nuances of IT hardware lifecycle management.
So we have this massive looming wall of regulation and data standardization. But I have to ask the cynical question, is this actually going to make the data center industry greener? Or is it just going to create a multi-billion-dollar boom market for ESG consultants, compliance lawyers, and reporting software? Because the sources point out a startling gap between corporate ambition and operational reality. A 2024 report found that while 69% of data center operators loudly promote their sustainability goals, only 17% actually prioritize sustainability criteria when they are negotiating and procuring new IT hardware.
That massive chasm between marketing and procurement is exactly where regulatory risk lives. And the sheer terror of this new regulatory enforcement has actually birthed a fascinating counterproductive trend called greenhushing.
Greenhushing. So instead of greenwashing, exaggerating your environmental virtues, you just take your website down and stop talking entirely.
Precisely. Companies are intentionally hiding their genuine, verifiable sustainability efforts, or simply refusing to publish data that they actually have because they fear that any public claim, even a true one, will invite brutal scrutiny from regulators or attract opportunistic litigation from activist groups.
They're terrified of getting sued.
Exactly. They decide that the safest legal strategy is absolute silence. But for investors, this is a disaster. A lack of data is just as dangerous as fraudulent data. If a developer is greenhushing, an investor cannot verify if that developer is actually mitigating their hydrological risk or if their building is about to be rendered a stranded asset by the European CSRD mandates. Silence is no longer a viable defense mechanism.
Which brings us to the final unifying piece of this puzzle. We've looked at the concrete, The grids, the water, the communities, and the laws. Now, how are the people holding the checkbooks, the various tiers of the financial sector, actually navigating this multidimensional minefield?
It requires a highly nuanced approach because different types of financial players are exposed to these physical and transition risks in entirely different ways. The asset class defines the risk profile. Let's start with public equities.
Okay, the retail or institutional investor buying stock in Microsoft, Google, or NVIDIA on the open market.
In public equities, you are insulated from single asset failure, but you are highly exposed to systemic tech trends, macro regulatory shifts, and broad public sentiment. If a global grassroots movement against AI's massive energy consumption gains traction, or if the European Union suddenly slaps a massive carbon tax specifically on high compute data centers, the tech giants' valuations will feel that headwind immediately. However, your risk is diversified across their entire software and services business model.
But what about real estate investors? The funds that actually own the physical shells.
Real estate investors face a brutal, concentrated reality. As we noted earlier, adding a hyperscale data center to a standard commercial property portfolio explodes your average carbon intensity per square foot. You take on the massive Scope 3 embodied carbon risk from the thousands of tons of concrete and steel. More importantly, you are hyper-exposed to the localized physical climate risks of that specific GPS coordinate. If you own a data center in a region that begins experiencing unprecedented multi-week extreme heat waves that physically overpower the mechanical cooling systems, your asset goes offline. You can't move the building.
Then you have the infrastructure investors, the massive funds that view these facilities the same way they view toll roads, shipping ports, or airports.
Infrastructure investors are generally hunting for long-duration, highly predictable, contracted revenue streams. But the ESG reality is forcing them to rewrite their underwriting models. They now have to price in long-term energy security. They have to ask, will this specific power grid actually have enough electricity to keep this asset viable in 2035? They have to price in the regulatory capex, the massive capital expenditure that will be legally required to retrofit the cooling systems to meet new European efficiency laws 5 years from now. And they face the ultimate infrastructure nightmare, stranded asset risk. If the local grid rapidly decarbonizes and gets cheaper, but the data center is legally locked into a 20-year offtake contract with a legacy natural gas plant to guarantee its uptime, the valuation of that asset craters.
And what about private equity? The buyout funds. Their entire business models is usually predicated on buying an asset, aggressively optimizing its operations, and selling it at a massive premium within 5 to 7 years.
Which creates a fascinating, almost unresolvable friction. Private equity faces the fundamental challenge of a very short hold period intersecting violently with long-duration physical climate risks. If a PE firm buys a data center today and wants to exit the investment in 2031, the institutional buyer on the other side of that transaction is going to demand a highly credible, mathematically verified, fully costed roadmap to achieving net zero emissions by 2040. If the PE firm spent those 5 years just maximizing short-term cash flow and hasn't laid the expensive physical groundwork for decarbonization, if they haven't secured clean power contracts or planned for liquid cooling retrofits, their exit valuation will suffer a massive discount.
The sources highlight a really interesting, highly specific financing tool that is emerging to bridge this gap, specifically for retrofits. It's called CPACE, Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing.
CPACE is a brilliantly structured financial instrument that is unlocking massive amounts of capital for the sustainable transition.
Let's use an analogy to break down how CPACE functions in the real world. It's like taking the hollowed-out, abandoned shell of a 1990s blockbuster video or a dead suburban shopping mall and completely retrofitting it to become the central nervous system for ChatGPT. By reusing the existing concrete and steel structure, you keep your Scope 3 embodied carbon incredibly low compared to pouring a massive new foundation. But you still need $50 million to buy the state-of-the-art immersion cooling vats and the high-efficiency electrical switchgear. Traditional mezzanine debt for that kind of retrofit is wildly expensive, maybe 12 or 15% interest.
Exactly. And that high cost of capital kills the green retrofit. This is where CPACE steps in. CPACE allows property owners to fund up to 100% of the hard and soft costs of energy efficiency, water conservation, and structural resilience upgrades. But instead of being structured as traditional corporate debt, the financing is repaid through a long-term assessment attached directly to the local property tax bill, often amortized over 20 to 30 years at a much lower fixed interest rate.
Because it's tied to the property tax, not the developer's corporate balance sheet.
Correct. It is non-recourse to the sponsor, and the debt legally transfers to the new owner if the property is sold. It is an off-balance sheet miracle for developers looking to retrofit older, inefficient real estate into state-of-the-art ESG-compliant data centers without destroying their internal rate of return.
I love how complex this has become. We used to just ask if a commercial building had good Wi-Fi, a solid roof, and cheap rent. Now, if you want to invest in the backbone of the digital economy, you're aggressively auditing the hydrological stress levels of a localized water basin, tracking the methane leakage rates of a utility's upstream gas supplier via satellite, and demanding auditable end-of-life recycling protocols for a piece of silicon. It is an incredible, necessary evolution of what it means to conduct financial due diligence.
And that immense complexity, that multidimensional puzzle, is precisely where the financial alpha is found for savvy investors. To be successful in this space over the next decade, you cannot just look at the lease agreement. You have to map the entire physical and environmental value chain. You must constantly hold in your mind the two fundamental overarching paradoxes that define this entire industry.
Lay them out for us. What are the two grand paradoxes?
The first is scale versus sustainability. The relentless economic and technological logic of the AI arms race demands exponentially larger facilities, denser server racks, and staggering amounts of compute power. But this explosive growth is colliding head-on with the reality that planetary boundaries, our carbon budgets, our fresh water tables, our available land use are finite and rapidly tightening. Reconciling infinite exponential digital growth with finite physical planetary resources is the grand engineering and financial challenge of our time.
And the second paradox.
Short-term reliability versus long-term decarbonization. The business model of the digital economy demands that absolute 5 nines of uptime, 99.9999% reliability. Today, right now, the cheapest, most technologically secure way to guarantee that a facility stays online during a winter storm or a grid failure is to rely on massive diesel generators or localized natural gas peaker plants. But the long-term survival of the business, avoiding regulatory fines, satisfying investor mandates, and maintaining social license demands a rapid transition to absolute net zero emissions. Bridging the treacherous gap between the dirty, messy reality of today's power grid and the pristine, clean energy promises of 2030 is where the hardest, most vital work is happening.
This has been an absolutely monumental journey through the physical internet. We started at the gleaming trillion-dollar tip of the hyperscaler iceberg, the massive AI models, and the megafunds, and we dove deep into the submerged, heavy reality of the supply chain. We unpacked the strained utility grids of Dublin. We debated the radioactive risks of restarting 3 Mile Island. We explored the physics of deep-frying servers in dielectric fluid to save water. We looked at the local communities fighting to protect their green belts, and we saw how European regulators are finally writing the complex rules of the road to kill greenwashing.
It is a vast, deeply interconnected, and highly fragile thermodynamic system.
It really is. And as we wrap up, I want to address you, the listener, directly. Because when we interact with technology, it is so easy to feel completely detached from the physical world. You are just tapping a piece of glass. But whether you are an infrastructure investor allocating billions of dollars to a new fund, a tech professional coding the next generation of large language models, or just a heavy user of AI tools in your daily life, you are an active participant in this ecosystem. Every single prompt you type into a chatbot, every hyper-realistic image you ask an AI to generate, every algorithmic trade you execute on your phone, it all has a distinct physical planetary cost. It requires a drop of water from an aquifer, a puff of carbon into the atmosphere, a fraction of a millimeter of land, and a gram of copper. The cloud is not in the sky. The cloud is on the ground.
And as we close out today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering concept to explore on your own, building on everything we've discussed. We have spent this entire time analyzing the current trajectory, the massive, frantic build-out of these gigawatt-scale campuses, all predicated on the assumption that the demand for AI compute power will go up exponentially forever.
Right.
But consider the alternative scenario. What if the software engineers succeed wildly and the AI models of the near future become vastly more mathematically efficient, requiring only a fraction of the hardware compute power? Or from an economic perspective, what if the massive enterprise spending bubble on AI tools bursts because the software fails to deliver the promised productivity gains? If the underlying demand suddenly shifts, what happens to these colossal, resource-hungry facilities? Could the world's most advanced, incredibly expensive data centers become the largest, most costly stranded real estate assets in human history by 2035?
Wow. That is a chilling, entirely necessary question to ponder as billions of dollars are poured into the concrete today. The physical footprint is permanent, even if the digital demand is not. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It is always an absolute joy to discover the hidden, grinding mechanics of our digital world with you. We encourage you to look closely at the technology you use every single day and keep questioning the hidden physical impacts behind your screen. Until next time, stay curious.